Namaste and good day everyone. My name is Dr. Varalakshmi Divakarla. I am a second year DM student at NRI Medical College. I work in the intensive care unit, and the purpose for today's class is to discuss or to learn a little bit about communication in the ICU. We know communication in the ICU is very complex, but it is a core component of patient-centered care as we understand currently. Now, the ICU environment or healthcare environment is a very complex environment, and there are several factors which influence the state of affairs in one particular ICU. It depends on the kind of patients that we have, the kind of turnover of patients that we have, the physicians, the patients, the family members, then whether it is a government setup, whether it is a private setup, and the other systems, the other disciplines that are involved, whether it's a closed ICU, whether it's an open ICU, and the general state of affairs is what determines the particular state of affairs in one particular ICU. And when you come to the scope of communication in an ICU like this, it is immense. There is communication amongst family members, there is communication between the team members of the critical care unit, then there is communication between the critical care doctors and the other multi-speciality doctors, then there is communication between the staff, the nursing staff and the doctors, then between the physiotherapists, between the respiratory therapists, between the patient and the family, patient and the doctors, patient and the sisters. So the scope of communication is almost limitless when you come to the ICU. So now let's start with communication with the patient. Now this is from the perspective of a critical care physician. Now what is expected of a critical care physician when he or she speaks to a patient? Now what we see here, a blurred image of the sister and the surroundings, is what the patient most likely sees in an ICU. Most of the times they are sick patients, they cannot communicate easily, they cannot see well, they cannot hear well, because the ICU is a very high noise atmosphere, and they usually leave their spectacles and their hearing aids, etc. with their family. So they see a very blurred world around them, and they are most of the time in a very, very anxious, desperate state. Now we do understand that verbal communication research has proven that whenever patients are spoken to, the outcomes are better. They understand things better, they cooperate with us better, and outcomes are better. This works both for conscious and unconscious patients. But despite knowing this, the amount of time that we as doctors or even nurses spend on communication with patients, especially unconscious patients, is very, very minimal. So it's important for us to acknowledge both unconscious and conscious patients during our daily practice. It's also important to remember that whose perspective matters most. It is the patient's perspective. It is nothing else that matters more than that in the ICU. What are the problems? Like I already said, patients have hearing defects. There could be a language barrier between the patient and the doctor. Patients could be illiterate, they wouldn't be able to understand what is happening in the ICU. So it's important for us to use alternate communication tools. So what are the options that we have in this front? How can we communicate with patients who have an endotracheal tube or a tracheostomy tube, or not able to understand clearly what you're trying to say? You can, the most simple one that we use is a pad and a pen. We use a paper and a pen. Most of the times patients are not able to write legibly, so that becomes very difficult. We could use magic slates, we could use boards to write upon, we could use printed charts which have images of the common problems that we anticipate. These are readily available to be downloaded, and these can be used very commonly. We could also use a keypad kind of a structure where awake enough patients can sort of type whatever they want to communicate with us. Or we could use skills like lip reading. It requires a little bit of patience and time, but lip reading helps us a lot. So does nodding, so does understanding gestures and blinking. These are tools that we commonly use in the ICU. There are several electronic voice output communication tools as well, but unfortunately in our country the access we have to these is very limited. So not all patients are the same. Groves et al. Have classified patients, ICU patients, into 4 categories: dependent clingers, entitled demanders, manipulative help rejecters, and self-destructive deniers. I'm sure while you're listening to these names, you've already figured out a few patients and you remember a few patients belonging to each one of these classes. So communication with one is never the same. One tool, one rule doesn't fit everybody, one size doesn't fit all. That works very true here as well. So we have to manipulate, we have to change the way we communicate depending on what kind of patients there are. But there are some ground rules which apply to every bit of communication with the patient. What are these? Number 1, empathy. Always empathize with patient. Try to get into their shoes. Try to look at the world the way they are seeing it at that particular moment. Number 1. Be a non-judgmental listener. Be patient. Intolerance is a no-no in the ICU. Be direct in your conversations. Set clear limits. If you feel patients are taking too much of your time, tell them that okay, I have 5 minutes to spend with you, or I have 10 minutes to spend with you, so that he or she understands and they are able to complete their conversation in that particular time frame. Then referring to consultants, psychiatry, other consultants also help sometimes, and bring in the family. The most important thing that we can do. Another thing, it's not such a common situation in our ICUs. Most of the times our decisions are taken by surrogate, or by family members. But whenever you take informed consent, it's very important to remember the 5 basic principles. One is that you disclose information very clearly and completely as possible. Second, you have to evaluate whether the patient who is, or the family member or the surrogate who is giving you the consent is competent enough, whether they are able to understand what you have told them, whether this consent is voluntary or whether it is being forced upon them, and this has to help you in making the decisions, and whether they are capable of making the decisions at that point of time. So another point of worry for patients most of the time is when they get discharged from the ICU. They have several fears about discharge. Most of the patients, they don't want to go out of the ICU because they understand that care wouldn't be the same once they get out of the ICU. So at this point of time, it makes sense to take a couple of minutes and you sort of clear all their questions, answer all their questions, clear all their doubts, and see that they are not scared to go out of the ICU. Again, an understanding of the risk factors for psychological problems. We all know that a lot of ICU patients have a lot of PTSD, anxiety, all those kind of problems after they are discharged home, once they get home. So if you know what risk factors they are, some of them are modifiable, some of them are not. So we can work on the modifiable risk factors. That is when patients are, or family members are too tired, when they have concerns regarding adequacy of medical care, when there is discussion, when there is commotion regarding end of life issues, and whenever there is inadequate communication. I think all these we can sort of control with better and effective communication. The non-modifiable risk factors, if patients have pre-existing mental illness, there's nothing much that you can do about it. When patients are women, when the person in contention is the spouse or the ICU patient, and if the admission diagnosis is something very tragic, which is very, say, a road traffic accident or a motor vehicle crash or a bomb blast, those kind of things, and when patient dies, of course there's nothing much that you can do on this front, but what you can definitely work on is the modifiable risk factors. Next, let's move on with family. Again, families come in all kinds of sizes, shapes, and colors, whatever it is, and characteristics. Now, we are taking care of the patient, right? The families don't pay us consultation. The families don't, are not our patients. But looking after families is an integral part of our job. Our job doesn't end with looking after the patient itself. So we are not doing a favor when we talk to a patient's relative or patient's family. It's very much part of our job. Very important to remember that. Most of the times, what are families looking for? What are patients' attendants looking for? They are looking for information. Why are they looking for information? Because they are in a state of despair. They feel hopeless. The moment somebody comes to the ICU, they feel that death is on the cards and probably going to be the end of the story soon. So they are very afraid, they are worried, they are sometimes very angry because the timeline that it takes for patients to come to the ICU, there's already issues maybe in a hospital elsewhere or in your own hospital, or there have been a few errors which have led to this, or there have been a few misunderstandings within the family, whatever. Most of the attendants tend to be angry. If this has been happening for a long time, then they are very, very exhausted as well. So it's important for you to take time to find the right place and the right person to communicate to. It's also important that you don't give conflicting information. One person saying one, the other person saying something that doesn't match with it. It's the worst possible scenario and the perfect sort of combination for conflict, for problems. So whatever information has to be clear, accurate, timely and honest. That will go a long way. Whenever you talk to attendants, some things you need to remember. No physiology, please. They are not medical students. They are not here to learn about medical physiology. What you should give them is, you should give them the primary diagnosis and you should tell them about the organs that are involved. Agreed. You should give a balanced but cautious estimate of prognosis. It's important to remember that all the classifications that we have, all the scoring systems that we have, most of the time they are applicable to populations. So they are like percentages. If a person has this severe illness, then there is a 20% possibility of mortality or a 40% chance of mortality. You can never prognosticate individual patients based on any of your scientific scores, right? So it's better not to bring those number jargons whenever it is possible. It makes more sense to describe the treatments that you will use, say a dialysis or a ventilator or a vasopressor support or anything, or an ECMO or whatever it is that you are doing. If you feel that patients are intelligent enough to know, to understand, you give them access to printed materials, or you can give them links to information on the net so that they can read and understand if you don't have that much of time. Then it's also important to explain to them the roles of different members of the ICU, what the admin is going to do, what the senior staff are going to do, what the physiotherapist is going to do, why so many other consultants are being roped into this case. That kind of a thing will go a long way. It's also important to remember that we have to keep in mind whether when you say something, when you give a sort of a list of information, whether comprehension has been good or not that good, because it takes a lot of time for people to understand, especially when you start using medical jargon and lot of medical terms. Then it also depends on the emotional state. If patients are still, if the family is still in a state of shock, most of the time they don't make sense of what you have been talking all along. Sometimes language again can be a barrier, even if it is the same language. If they don't understand your accent, or if they don't understand a few words, then they'll miss the game entirely. Again, conflicting messages always create a problem. So what is our goal when we communicate? It is effective only if it meets the needs of the audience. Now I tell about severity of ARDS, if I tell about the options, if I start with oxygen and I go to NIV and I go to ventilator and I go to ECMO, if the patient wants to know simply as to whether the kidney, the family wants to know, if yesterday you said that the kidney is not working, today I just want to know that status and whether the patient needs dialysis, and if you are not giving that information, the person's mind will just shut down. They will stop listening at one point of time. So it's important for you to tell them what they want to know. So for that to happen, again, some ground rules. One, that you should talk to them regularly. You should coordinate and designate one person from the family for a continuation in the process. Number two, then this one person should be asked to disseminate the information to the rest of the family. When you talk, it's important that your body language should match your verbal language, whatever you are speaking. If you are not sure, you can ask the listener to restate what you are telling. So that, especially if you are giving sensitive information, if it requires a consent, if it requires some action to be taken, then it's always wise to ask them to restate what you have said. So this will help you reinforce your message. What else can you do? You can summarize at the end of the conversation. You know what they have said, you know what you have told. At the end of the conversation, it makes sense to summarize the whole conversation. Like say for 6 or 8 minutes, whatever you have spoken, you summarize it in 15 or 20 seconds. That will go a long way. So when you take input from families, when you talk to families, most of the times we start with an understanding that if you give prognostic information, in the sense that if I say there is a high chance that your patient is going to survive, or if I say that there is very minimal chance that this man is going to make it, then that will lead the family or the surrogates to make decisions. But unfortunately that is not so. What determines consents to procedures and to treatments that we do are most of the time patient's characters, the illness history, how long or short it has been, the physical appearance, the relatives' presence at the bedside, belief in God, and how optimistic the patient is, how optimistic the family is, and their faith. Most of the time what you say about a disease or about a particular treatment makes very little impact. They have already predetermined everything. They will just say yes or no depending on all the above stated factors. But even then, it is very important that we explain everything that we want to do for a particular patient and seek input from families, determine what preferences they have, and it again, you have to sort of take a call on what kind of language you use, what kind of words you use, depending on how educated the family is and how understanding they are of your discussion. Okay, again, differences in opinion bound to happen. You have lot of difficult relatives. They could be ranging from people who keep calling you all the time, bugging you with calls, and people who are not able to comprehend, understand medical information, however simplistically you may sort of do it, how much ever effort you put into it. Sometimes they may be aggressive, they may be accusatory, they may be threatening to you, or there are those family members who persistently demand medically inappropriate treatments. So what do you do about this? The only way to go ahead is to reach a consensus. Again, ground rules. 1, keep calm. Don't get agitated in front of the family. 2, listen. Get to understand the other point of view. Very important. 3, it's important to know the local laws and professional guidelines like end of life care or withdrawal of treatment. Those kind of things, very important to know how law stands on these points. Involve other people, involve friends. If the immediate family is too agitated, too shocked, ask them to call their distant relatives, ask them to call their friends, close friends. You involve the other people, the other doctors, other teams who are involved in the treatment of that patient. Very important. So that the emphasis is no longer us versus them. It's like they all come to know that we are actually trying to help them. Give them time. Don't tell them you have told them now this patient is, I need to intubate this patient. Don't tell them 1 minute before you are going to intubate and then give them a minute. No, these are big decisions, they take time. So you have to talk to them in advance and give them little bit more time to take those decisions. Okay. And then once you have told them, never go ahead with the procedure, however important you think it is, without taking proper consent. Only after they agree you should go ahead and do those procedures. In all this, bear in mind, it's always good to have an open mind. Sometimes what they may say may make lot of sense and you may have to retract, you may have to take a few steps back. But it's never wrong to do that, because finally we should all remember that it is the patient that we are not bothered about, not our own egotistic values and whatever we think about the patient. That doesn't matter at all. Next, we'll talk a little bit about breaking bad news. What is bad news? Anything that drastically, negatively alters the patient's view of his or her own future. Is it a good scenario to be in? None of us wants to, give bad news. Why are we scared? Because there is always that fear of being blamed for what is happening. Giving a bad news always evokes reactions, and those emotions are not good to see and to feel. You sometimes end up expressing emotions. Again, we are most of the times not comfortable with that. Attendants, family ask us lot of questions. We may not have all the answers all the time. There is always fear of the unknown and untaught. What if they start asking about some treatment that I don't know about? What if they start asking why you have not done this, why you have not done that? Those kind of questions. And there is also the personal fear of illness and death. So this is what makes delivering bad news very, very difficult. Again, some ground rules which help us on most days. One, if patient's family is completely unprepared, patient has come just now, crashed in an hour, died, or the previous day you have spoken to family and you have told them that maybe he or she is doing all right, and suddenly overnight there has been a big event and patient has died. So what do? Use warning shot techniques, in the sense, call them to your room, silently or calmly tell them, I have something to talk to you. Can you please have a seat? It's better you sit down before I start talking to you about this. So this intuitively, it gives them a mental preparation that there is something that is not very comfortable that is going to be stated or that is going to be talked about. Number one. Try to break bad news as early as possible and as clearly as possible. If a patient has died, please use the words death or passed away or expired in the conversation. Okay? Show compassion. That person that has died is a patient to you. He is one among 4 or 5 people that have died on your unit on that particular day, or he's just, most of the times he's just another patient to you, but he is or she is a loved one for their family. So show some compassion. It's okay to get a little emotional, nothing wrong with it, and allow a possibility to ask questions, to answer questions in this conversation. While you are doing this, you have to take a little bit of time and understand, acknowledge what the family members are feeling about the news that you have given them. How well are they taking it? Number one. Then you have to summarize, in the sense, once the family has spoken something to you, you have to summarize it back to them so that they know that you have understood what they are talking to you about. Encourage them to ask questions, and then once you have answered, check that they have understood what you have told them. After giving a little bit of time, then give them the next plan. So now this bad thing has happened. So suppose patient has died, you have to give them details about what the next administrative and other formalities are going to be. In case it is patient has not died but has worsened, so what is the next plan? Whether you are escalating treatment or whether you are making a statement that continuation of treatment is futile, whether you are going into end of life care mode, or whether you are going into supportive treatment mode or palliative care mode, you have to make this conversation after giving just a little bit of time. After a conversation like this, it's very important to take a deep breath, take a few minutes for yourself and relax just a bit. Again, where to talk? We need a comfortable place to talk, ideally where both parties can be seated and there is a scope for us to comfort them. That is, most of the times it's very difficult, especially in the COVID environment. So what practical tips? Again, these are most of the times what we all routinely practice. go to a comfortable private location. It shouldn't be adjacent to the patient, or standing by the bed where another patient is undergoing CPR, or another patient is being intubated, or code blue is being called. So it's very important that we choose a comfortable and private location, that we know the patient's name, that we verify that we are talking to the correct relatives, that we introduce all patients, all the persons who are present, when we are talking to them, give enough chairs for all of them. It's better if we all turn our phones off when we have this kind of conversation. Decide before what all topics you are going to discuss, allow time for questions, and if they have to come back to you with a consent or with their plan, then you have to identify one person and give them that responsibility so that they get back to you. Again, summarize your discussion at the end of the plan and make a plan for that day. Again, there are several tools like the Spikes tool that you can use, which will help you systematically approach breaking bad news. What is important to remember is that just because you have met the needs of the family, does it mean that they'll be better satisfied with your care? Does it mean that it will mean better numbers? Obviously not. That doesn't happen. But it will give them a better ICU experience. So the next time, in case they or their family members are in the ICU, they know that they are in a much safer zone. Going to co-workers now. Co-workers, ICU is usually a large team. Suppose it's a say a chunk of like say 12 or 14 beds. We usually have one or two consultants, then we have a few residents, then we have resident doctors, then we have sisters, maybe 5 or 6 of them, we have administrators. So it's a huge team that we are talking about. These are all patients, these are all persons still in the ICU. Then we have people walking in from outside. The communication between co-workers is pretty complex. And you have all sorts of people. You have those people who have who are excellent team team players. So they work best when they are in a team. On the other hand, you always have people who are loners, who just like to do their bit and get out of the ICU at the earliest. So what are the common communication problems that you have in ICU? Most of them pertain to hierarchy. Breaking hierarchy and communicating an issue, a problem, is very, very difficult. There is always the pecking rule, and it's usually that the junior most gets to be pecked by everybody else, but as you go up the seniority rung, so the pecking reduces. No, you just cannot go and talk to your boss. That is a big problem in most of the ICUs. Or it is a problem where communication is very, very bad. People don't know how to talk to each other, and the moment they start talking, it looks more like a fight, more like an argument, rather than exchange of information or exchange of communication. Then there is also fear of being reprimanded, fear of being ridiculed, fear of being made fun of. That stops people from communicating. But it is very important that we share, we join, and we unite in making understanding common. Okay, and because it's a multidisciplinary team, because there are so many people involved, different psychologists, different people, that's another challenge. So what do we do about this? Most important is to assign tasks very clearly. Then it's important for all of us to practice closed loop communication. We all understand what closed loop communication is. So to this end, we have lot of tools. We have the ISBAR tool, the DATAS tool, the DMIST tool, the SOAP tool, all sorts of things that we have. We should incorporate whatever works best in our scenario and use it. We all know that working in a team is a given, especially if it is in the ICU. No person can run an ICU alone, single-handedly. It comes with lot of advantages. It will improve your efficiency. By teamwork, we need to understand again, it's not 10 people working in one room. There are always chances or situations where 10 people are working, but they are working as 10 individuals. That doesn't help us a lot. What what is important is when all of them think that they belong to one team and they work, that is what we are talking about as teamwork. So that will definitely improve efficiency, outcomes, cost of care, your errors will come down, your morale will improve, your satisfaction will improve, you will feel less tired, there will be fewer delays in whatever that you want to need to do, and you can retain your high quality committed nursing staff. That's very, very important. Does it have a disadvantages? Yes, there are a few disadvantages of working in a team. There's that personal glorification is not there. Everything, sometimes there are delays because of teamwork. Because first you have to sort of collaborate with your team, come to a consensus, then go ahead and do things. But on any given day, teamwork is a lot more advantageous than not being in a team. Next, coming to intra-team conflicts. Whenever there are two people, conflicts are bound to happen. Nothing abnormal about it. Again, important causes are egos, difference in values, when you want to maintain strict hierarchy, when ideas differ as to the focus of care, when there is disagreement over major goals of therapy. This is where most conflicts are seeded. So what can we do about this? That we can do is to improve handovers. Second thing, promote cooperation and collaboration. Again, ground rules. Be aware that there could be different perspectives. People could think of a problem in a different way. It doesn't matter as long as their focus is on getting a patient better, and it's for the betterment of the team. Number one. Whenever you are in trouble, whenever there is an issue, solicit input from all the other team members, whether they are juniors, whether they are senior. Make the most out of rounds. Let the information exchange be very timely, succinct, and very accurate. Let rounds not be consumed by trivial talk which is of no use to anybody. Let the information be very, very consistent. Information exchange and information in general be very consistent and accurate. Have very clear long-term plans and short-term plans for each particular patient. Your rounds have to be a balance of teaching and clinical service. It's very important to pursue a problem-based or problem-oriented approach. Setting goals for that particular day, for that particular patient, for that unit, for that team is very important, and to create guidelines of care and follow them stringently. Then coming to handling errors. How do we handle errors? We know that 85% of errors are because of communication troubles, problems in communication. So encourage discussions of safety, very important. There has to be a confidential reporting system to have errors notified. Voice your specific findings, that's very important. Think out loud. Don't there's usually this conversation where you think, no, I thought about it, but I was like, I forgot to say it out, or I thought maybe it's not required, that kind of thing. It's very important for you to think out loud. Nobody can read your mind, but they can hear what you say. So it's important to say what is in your mind. Perform periodic reviews of all the quantitative information that you have. Audits is what we are talking about. Then focus on solution, not on blaming. Don't say this particular sister, or this particular doctor, this particular therapist, this particular, no, it's never that. If your focus is on solutions, that is the way forward, not one particular person. Double check crucial data. Whenever you are having errors on similar fronts or mistakes have been done too often in the past, it's very important that you double check all this data properly. Then we might all think, oh my god, this communication skills looks like we need MBAs to be here, or whether some people just have it and some people just don't. So let's leave communication to those people and let me just do my job. No, we are all very wrong. Communication is an extremely learnable skill, and with training, self-training and a little bit of effort, all of us can become very, very good communicators. There are certain few strategies that we'll talk about. First one, as always, is being aware. First thing that you need to be aware of is your self emotion. How do you respond to a given situation? The best way to do that is go stand in front of a mirror. Imagine somebody is angry with you, or imagine somebody is asking questions. Look at your face. Look at the frowns on your forehead. Look at how you grimace. Look at how your face changes from the nice one that is to something that is very, very ugly looking. So it's very important. So then we know, once we are aware, then we know how to avert that kind of a reaction. Self-assessment, very important. Being confident but not arrogant, very important. And being culturally aware. Now if you are working in NRM Medical College in Mangalgiri, or if you're working in a corporate hospital in a big city, or if you're working in a sort of top-notch institution, or if you're working in a transplant ICU, or if you're working in a trauma ICU, if you're working in a sort of oncology ICU, the perspectives, the cultures are entirely different. The kind of the conversations that you have, the kind of environment is very, very different. So it's very important that you are culturally aware about where you are and that particular ICU. Second important thing is to learn to intuit better, to get intuition. What is intuition? To know something before it happens. So there's a cycle of events, 3 or 4 events. Most of the times you know what the 5th event is going to be. You know that when patients are not, family is not signing the consent form the first time, and when they want to talk to you repeatedly, once, twice, thrice, they want to come and see the patient, they are giving signals that we want to make sure whether the patient is doing well or no before I sign the form. It obviously all of us know that we are going to have a difficult conversation with this patient, with this family. So what do we do at that point of time? Do we just recognize that and leave it be? No. What makes sense is be proactive instead of reactive. Don't let them come with their sticks and their 10 people to hit you. Take time. Once you have recognized this, once you know there is going to be a problem, call all the family members, have a family meeting, talk to them, find out what all doubts they have, try to clear, and bring in all the other teams, whoever need to be, and go ahead and de-escalate the problem right there. The other thing is, of course, empathy. Very important that all of us empathize. That goes a long way in cutting down errors. Again, when you talk about communication, there are 2 things. There is one, the content, and the context. Content is what the information that you give, like the vitals, the lab reports, the x-rays, the scans, and the plans, like whatever, dialysis, ventilation, discharge or shift, whatever that is. But context involves the fillers. These are like what is your intonation, what tone you are using, what volume you are using, what is your choice of words, what is your facial expression when you are saying something, what is your body posture. So all this matter, right? So whenever you are giving information, make sure your content is accurate and your context is also appropriate. That's very important. So what are the tips? How can you do this? 1. Patient's family should always feel that they have access to you. That doesn't mean you give your phone number and let them call you at whatever time. They should know that during these fixed hours, we are going to get information no matter what. That is one thing. Second, be very compassionate when you talk to families, especially the non-verbal part is very important here. Give them regular updates. Avoid family meeting by yourself. Take the sister who is taking care of that, that person. If there are other consultants involved, take them with you. So, or if you have trainees, take them with you. Then ensure that there is time for you to talk to them without interruptions. Keep your phone aside or give it to one of your colleagues to take any important calls. Very important. Start the conversation slow. Prepare by knowing family's history and then knowing how much they understand about what has happened up until now. And then avoid using technical language as much as possible. Don't give too much of numerical data. Numbers are always confusing, so they'll think those numbers are your targets. They'll say, now if you talk about saturation or if you talk about BP, they'll not understand the complexities that are there. So avoid giving too much of numerical data. All right, it's okay to show emotions when you're talking to family sometimes, and they should always feel that they can talk freely with you. At the end of whatever conversation, you should have a plan. You should outline a plan which will focus on actual treatment or management for one particular patient. Another important concept that we should all understand and practice is active listening. I think we are in a world where we have forgotten to listen. We only want to talk all the time, but we have to get back to listening. But listening doesn't mean just plain, just listening. It means that you, one, pay attention when somebody is talking to you, and you hold judgment. Don't have preconceptions about the particular person that is talking to you or about the issue. Then clarify. If you don't understand what they are saying, take the time to clarify. So is it what you're telling me? So then they'll know that you're giving them 100% attention. Then you summarize whatever they have told at the end of the conversation, and also share. So this is what comprises active listening. Then team communication. Again, structured communication tools are there. Then democratic versus hierarchical. Democratic is the preferred one, but you have to take a call. We can do simulation exercises where you can do role playing, and then we'll know where we are going wrong. We can do debriefing sessions and improve our communication. Inclusive teams, which have all kinds of people, work better, and to be able to create an organizational culture which will support the healthcare team, because it's not just the healthcare team. There's a big support system that lies outside it, which has to be conducive for us to work better. Coming to communication per se, by now we all know verbal is only a small part of it. Non-verbal is what is important. The way you gesture, the way your eyes move, the way your hands move, the way you make eye contact, the tone of your voice conveys more than what a few words do. So it's important that we keep our posture, our gesturing right. Simple, postures that we can practice with a little patience and time will go a long way in improving our communication with patients, family, and our co-workers, and make our days better and slightly happier ones. Thank you so much.